Hello, everybody, and welcome to Bernie Goldberg's No BS Zone with my good friend John Daly, reporting today. Not John, I'm reporting today from South Florida, as you can tell. John, how you doing?
Good, good. How about you, Bernie?
Well, I'm anxious to get right to it, as they say, about the election. Look, it's easy to write this off as the result of inflation, the result of a southern border, of crime. All that matters. That Kamala Harris was a bad candidate, that matters. But I want to go in a different direction today. In high school, you remember the science class lesson about for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. It's not
Yep.
just the law of physics, it's a law of political science too. I think voters, ordinary Americans, I use that in the best sense of the word, ordinary Americans, just got tired of being condescended to, being talked down to, being called a basket of deplorables, being called garbage, being called Mark Cuban saying that only stupid and weak women hang around Donald Trump. Uh, the whole, if you were against boy biological boys playing on girls' teams, you were a homophobic bigot. If you were against illegal immigration coming into the country, you were an anti-immigrant bigot. I think people just said, I have had enough of that. You talk down to us, we're going to talk down to you, and we're going to do it in the election. I'm not saying that was the only reason. As I said, all the obvious reasons mattered. Inflation, the border, crime, a bad candidate, Kamala Harris, it all mattered. But I think this mattered too. People don't like being talked down to, and they finally said, enough. What do you think, John?
Well, I think there's something to that, at least part of it. I do think this was uh, far and away, comes back to high inflation. I mean, high prices, inflation, just to be clear, it is back down now, but prices are locked in so high that people are still feeling the pinch. And I think that's something that just affects everybody. And I think this happened under the Biden administration. He's to blame for some of it. COVID is to blame for some of it. But to voters, from their perspective, most people just see, he's been in power for 4 years now. We've been dealing with these high prices for a few years now. I think that's the big one. I think the border stuff is a big deal too. And I think what you said, I think is correct. I think some people feel that way. Personally, I always feel like Donald Trump is always talking down to people too, but he was out of power. So it's Biden and the Democrats are the ones that have been in power, and so that's I think who voters want to punish for a number of things.
I think the media elite was also a factor in all of this. They're telling us, you better be concerned. Bad Bunny is up in arms over this Puerto Rican thing. Bad Bunny, who cares what Bad Bunny said? No, you know that Donald Trump won among Latino men nationwide 55 to 44. So you could take Bad Bunny and shove him. And the media elites were emphasizing all the wrong issues, all the wrong issues. And I'm acknowledging again all the things you mentioned and all the things I mentioned about inflation and all that. Of course they mattered. Of course they mattered. But I think Democrats will be making a big mistake if they say, well, all we have to do, you know, the reason we lost, is because the American people, those ordinary Americans who live in flyover country, they're so stupid. They don't realize how good they had it. They don't realize that Bidenomics was a roaring success. They don't realize, well, the border really was secure. They got tired of hearing that crap, that nonsense, and they got tired of hearing it from people who thought they were better than ordinary Americans. Don't I'm not saying that's the biggest single factor, but don't underestimate the power of people not wanting to be spoken down to.
I guess I'm a little bit of a loss because I don't know who Bad Bunny is. Is that a rapper or something?
A
um,
Puerto Rican rapper.
oh, okay, okay. So, but no, there's probably something to that. I do think though what you're saying is understated. So people like you and I who are very politically in tune, we hear all of that what you just described quite a bit. I'm pretty skeptical of how many people pay attention to that stuff from the mainstream media like they used to. I mean, the mainstream media and we probably should call it the legacy media at this point. Fox is obviously very mainstream too. And but I think that people are more and more tuned out of the legacy media. I don't think they have as much influence on people. I know that the politicians were doing that too, Democratic politicians. When Joe Biden is out there saying that this is the border's fine, all's good. Inflation's not going to last long. It's about over. Then it goes on for a few more years. I think that probably carries a little bit more weight. But I think the constant drumbeat of the MSNBC crowd. I don't really know if that really is the primary or even close to the primary factor with what we saw last night.
Well, what lesson do you suppose the Democrats are going to take from this defeat?
Oh, I'm not counting on them to take any lesson from it, to be honest. I don't think the parties really do that for the most part. But what I think what they should do is, well, there's a lot of lessons. I don't think this is. I think there's a lot of this has a lot to do with issues too, not necessarily policies, but issues. So I mean, it's you can't. Um, Biden has been a very ineffective president. He two of the big major problems, two of the three major problems, I think, were largely of his own making. This started his poll numbers started going down noticeably with the Afghanistan withdrawal. People realized that was a total botch. I would argue that it was always going to be a botch. It was a bad policy that both administrations shared, but we can get into that some other time. But the border stuff, that was largely of his making. We've long had problems with the border, but it got completely out of control under him. Inflation he added to wasn't the primary driver of high inflation, but yeah, I think people just he was so cavalier about these issues, like they didn't really matter, and I think that is Democrats should learn to address these serious issues. They've relied so long on the woke stuff, on the political correctness, on the identity politics, and that really, with all that focus on that, they haven't focused on the big things. And I think that's hopefully they would learn a lesson from that, but who knows?
I was watching CNN last night, well into the night, and Van Jones was on. He's a smart guy. He was literally on the verge of tears. I'm not exaggerating. And he said, we had a chance to elect a black woman, a woman of color. And once again, we rejected that. Come on. Come on. Is that what we're going to have to listen to now? Is that what it's going to be about? That if she were not a woman and a woman of color, this would have all been different. No, can't we just acknowledge that she was a bad candidate who, when asked on The View what she might have done differently than Joe Biden had done, she said, I can't think of anything. Boom, game over at that point. You can make a case that the kind of people who watch The View, who would be more likely to want to be a Kamala Harris supporter, said, you can't think of anything that Joe Biden did that you're not on board with? Not a good look. Not a good look at all.
No, I think that definitely hurt, and it can't be overstated too. I mean, I think she was a poor candidate for a number of reasons. I think she obviously had some good moments. That debate with Donald Trump, she really shined in that, really set Trump off. He imploded, and she got a bump out of that for a while. But I really think the bulk of the problem for the Democrats, just from a political standpoint, was that Biden, again, he had no business running for reelection, not in his condition. He should have announced after the midterms that he wasn't running. He should have afforded his party a real primary, which I think would have produced someone other than Harris. I don't think she would have been the nominee if that were the case. But he put them in the spot at the last minute. The best they could do is bring in an alternate, and the one they decided to bring in was directly tied with this very unpopular Biden administration, as the vice president. But Biden stayed into the last minute because of his ego, and I believe that we'd be looking at a different race if, and I'm not confident in a normal primary if the Democrats would have nominated someone like a Josh Shapiro, who I've been very high on, but I think it would have been a much different race if there was a different Democrat, someone disconnected from the Biden administration.
Well, Democrats couldn't stop talking about how Donald Trump was a threat to democracy. We can make a case that they're onto something there. We'll see. But they picked a nominee without the woman getting a single vote in any primary. What kind of democracy is that? And what I was getting at in the beginning, John, going beyond the obvious reasons of inflation and the border and crime, people notice stuff like that. They say, wait a second, you're accusing us of supporting somebody who's a threat to democracy. How? And you don't respect democracy enough to put up your nominee to a vote? You just coronate, you have a coronation by the political elites. I think this was, again, one of the reasons, a response to the media elites, to the extent that they're still media elites, to the political elites, to the cultural elites in academia and places like that. I don't want to beat a dead horse, just one last time. I just think that the elites look down their noses at people who live in flyover country, a dismissive term all by itself. If those people aren't sophisticated enough to live in wonderful places like Manhattan, and I think they said, you know what, screw me, screw you.
Well,
it might not have mattered at all if inflation was under control and if the southern border, in fact, was closed off and Biden and his team had done a good job for the past 4 years. Then what I'm saying might not have mattered at all. But given that they did a crummy job in the eyes of a majority of Americans, then the elite argument, I think, comes into play.
Just on the point you brought up a second ago about U.S. democracy, I don't discount the idea that some people had that going through their mind, where the Democrats didn't have a primary. I mean, obviously, U.S. democracy is a very different thing than a party nomination process. I mean, I would love to see all kinds of reforms made to our primary process, but I think maybe to the average Joe, there's something to that where a lot of people don't get that the party nomination process, they get to decide the rules. That's not a public thing. So to me, I wasn't offended by that. I thought that was one of the few good political movement ideas or not really a strategy, but one of the few good political developments in this election cycle was this. Even if it was last minute, Biden should not have been running. So I'm glad they did that. But I get your point. I get what you're saying.
Well, I've heard from friends who had no intention of voting for Kamala Harris, who said, well, this was a coronation. It was undemocratic. And I said, that's for Democrats to decide. You're not a Democrat. You don't have a voice in this. That said, John, I think enough people looked at it and said, this doesn't feel right to me. Just doesn't feel right.
I think that's probably true. If you don't mind, I was going to ask you about something else you brought up too. You talked about the there is a racial political realignment going on right now in politics, and we actually talked about this a couple of years ago. I think it was back during the midterms. how there has been this trend of ethnic minorities slowly starting to migrate away from the Democratic Party. And I think you and I agreed, and I certainly still believe that this is a good thing, whether we're talking about Donald Trump or Harris or whoever. I personally hate identity politics. I don't like racial pandering. I think public policy should transcend our country's racial differences. Um, but I don't, even though I don't think policy had a lot to do with this particular election, but I think this is actually a healthy thing. Just taking a broad step back, that we are looking at the electorate in broader terms than we were before.
Well, the Democratic coalition that has been a, a recipe for, to the extent that Democrats have won elections, it's because of that historic coalition. Young voters, Black voters, Latino, Hispanic voters, women. That coalition is cracking. I mean, in North Carolina, over 20%, I don't know what the national figures are, but in North Carolina, over 20% of Black men voted for Donald Trump. Nationwide, I mentioned this a few minutes ago, 55% of Latino men voted for Donald Trump. Everybody, all the media elites were telling us that the Madison Square Garden rally with that stupid joke about Puerto Rico was going to be a death knell for Donald Trump. It wasn't. It wasn't, because Latino voters cared more about other things, like inflation and even immigration. Even immigration. People who came here legally were not fans of people who snuck in across the border. So Democrats have taken this coalition of theirs for granted since Roosevelt, and it's been cracking slowly in recent years. And if the numbers that we saw yesterday hold up going forward, Democrats are going to have a tough time winning national elections, because they needed that Democratic coalition to hold firm. It may come back. Who knows what's going to happen over the next 4 years? It may come back. Democrats may win the next election in a landslide if Donald Trump goes off the deep end. But the coalition that Democrats counted on, and it was part of their historic reason for winning votes and winning elections, that may not be there anymore.
No, I think there's definitely going to have to be some changes, in the way the Democratic Party approaches things. I mean, they have relied so much on identity politics over the years, and political correctness, and I think for a long time that worked pretty well for them. But it's I think people have just become exhausted with a lot of that, and I think that's clear in what we're seeing in some of these results. Bernie, I was curious, what do you think a Trump 2.0 looks like? He'll be sworn into office in January, and do you have some things you're expecting to happen right off the bat or in the first year or so?
I'll tell you what I don't expect to happen. I don't expect the worst fears that Democrats were telling us about the end of democracy. I don't think that's going to happen. About a dictatorship, that's not going to happen. All the things they said, either they didn't believe it and they were trying to scare voters, or they did believe it. And how are they going to get behind Donald Trump if they really believed it? I think this business of we're on the verge of apocalypse because Donald Trump would be, if he were elected, I think it was all nonsense. America survived, as I said in my last column, America survived a World War, a Great Depression, a Second World War. They survived the McCarthy blacklist. They survived Nixon's enemies list. They survived the turbulent 60s. They survived 9/11. 9/11 brought down some buildings. It didn't bring down America. And the idea that they were trying to put forward, that a few votes in a key Democratic battleground state was going to bring down the whole kit and caboodle of American greatness, was idiotic. It was stupid. And I don't even think they believed it, but they were trying to win an election, so they said it. And I don't think any of that, John, is going to happen.
You and I never were on board with this. This will be the end of democracy thing. Obviously, I'll still argue that Donald Trump has been a threat to the Constitution. That's a different argument. But it is funny that going back to that column you wrote that you just talked about what we've survived as a country. I thought it was very well done. People should definitely check it out. It sort of cracked me up, some of the comment section responses to it, but like, Bernie, you don't understand. And kind of ignoring like everything you just said. If Harris gets in, we're screwed. It's all over, our country. But
I went on Twitter last night, and there was more of that there.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
People actually believe that crap, and it's crap. Kamala Harris, the idea that Kamala Harris was powerful enough to bring down America was ridiculous. Now, by the way, nothing I've said here is an endorsement of Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump, as I've said too many times already, I don't want to go through it a 10 millionth time, based on his character alone, shouldn't be president. But somebody had to be president, and the American people decided he was. This is what it comes down to, John. As bad as a lot of Americans thought he was, they thought she was worse. You can't escape that. Whatever they thought of him, with his convictions, with his character, with his crudeness, with his vulgarity, with his chronic dishonesty, they still thought she was worse. Well, they didn't think that was important enough to even care about.
No, I think that's true. As far as the Trump administration the next Trump administration, Trump 2.0. Personally, I think it's not going to be good. So take the democracy stuff. I'm not worried about democracy, imploding, but and I don't think it would have been good under Harris either. But I do think Trump 2.0 will be bad. I think in his first administration, and I'm not going to be bringing up any arguments you probably haven't already heard, but I think when he first came into power in 2017, there were a number of solid people. We'll call them establishment types. I know that's sort of a pejorative these days, but who I think helped steer Trump away from his worst impulses. And there's a long list of stories like that. I think this time is going to be different. I think he'll surround himself with a bunch of unserious yes people who will tell him that any off the cuff insane idea that he comes up with is a great idea, even if it's not legal or constitutional. I think the lawyers will be a little bit busy. I think the Supreme Court will be a little bit busier. I'm a little disheartened that people like Tucker Carlson, who recently claimed he was attacked in his bed by a demon, has so much influence on Trump. And I think once Trump starts imposing these tariffs that he's been campaigning on, these crippling things, Brian Riedel, who I had on the website for an interview a while back, he's a really good economist. He made the point last night on Twitter, if you thought Biden inflation was bad, just hold on, because if what Trump once gets in there, it's going to be a lot worse.
Well, let's see what happens.
Yeah,
I mean, we can't have it both ways, John. We can't say, as liberals were saying, you can't believe a word this guy says, and now they're going to believe every word he says because it suits their purpose. Donald Trump uses people to his own ends, and let's see who he puts in positions of power. And even those who he may want to put in positions of authority, they're going to know that there are people like Rudy Giuliani who's lost everything. Are they going to want to go down that road? Are they going to want to go down the road of Sidney, whatever the hell that stupid woman's name is, the lawyer Sidney, what's her name?
Sidney Powell.
Sidney Powell. Are they going to want to go down that road? I mean, a lot of people are either going to go to jail or are flipping on Donald Trump so they don't go to jail. I mean, you got to be pretty stupid to want to join that club. So I'm not sure about that. if you've got a last word, fine, but let me end with my last word. Just before we started recording this, I got an email from somebody who commented on the big Trump victory. He said, could you imagine how big it would have been if we had a sane candidate running?
Oh yeah, yeah. No,
Some truth to that.
no, there really is. I was going to ask you about that though, Bernie. So, do you think that Trump's victory in a way legitimizes the political tactic of election denial? And I mean, what I mean by that is he managed to convince millions and millions of Americans, including I think still 70 to 80% of Republican voters, that he never lost in 2020, which he very much did. And I think that I actually think that went a long way to keeping his political fortunes alive. I can only assume, and maybe I'm wrong, that more and more people are going to do that now. I mean, just deny that they lost and keep their political future, their hopes alive. Do you think that's kind of set a bad precedent?
I don't know. I wouldn't bet on it, but here's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that after 4 years, he goes away. I mean, really away, and has no influence in the Republican Party. Because if what we're going to get after Donald Trump is Donald Trump 2.0, Donald Trump light, Donald Trump's, you know, look-alike mini Donald Trump, then the Republican Party is going to be in trouble. He won this time because of all the reasons we've outlined in this no BS zone today. It isn't going to work going forward if they have a bad candidate. Trump won because of not only what we mentioned, but because they didn't want Kamala Harris. As I said, as bad as they thought he was, they thought she was worse. If Tucker Carlson, and this is crazy, but if he's the nominee, the Republicans are going to lose, and they deserve to lose. If another Donald Trump is the nominee, I don't even think J.D. Vance is another Donald Trump when he's free to be his own person. I was disappointed in J.D. Vance because he's a bright guy, but we'll see. Donald Trump should serve 4 years, get America straightened out as best he can, and go away. If that happens, the coalition that was the Democratic Party may no longer be a sure thing for Democrats, and Republicans may win elections going forward in bigger numbers than they have in the past.
All right. All right. I'm not sure if I have anything to add to that. Anything you'd like to talk about, Bernie? Anything else?
No, this was off the top of our heads because the election was over just a few hours ago, and we're putting this up in a few seconds. So hope we made some sense.
Yeah, and that's worth mentioning. We're recording this on Wednesday morning. We haven't really analyzed. There's still numbers that are coming in. I'm not
Right.
even sure at this point that Harris has come out and said anything. I assume that maybe by the time we air this, she'll concede the race, and maybe she already has. I don't know, but I think by the time this goes up, that'll probably be the case, which will be good. The peaceful transfer of power, the people conceding races that they lost. I think that's a very good thing. So, all right. Anything else, Bertie?
That's it. Let's hope for the best.
Absolutely.
America survived a lot. It will survive the next 4 years. Let's just hope for the best.
Hope is good. Hope is good. All right, Bernie. Thanks, everybody.